So she asked for claps and whistles and stomps, and I'm a lawyer, so now you can groan. Big data is very exciting with many enormous opportunities. And with ever-advancing technologies now being applied to big data, these opportunities are growing every day. And we've heard about many of those today. My discussion this afternoon is on trends in big data. And actually just one important trend. With every advancing technology, creative minds come together like we did today and create creative business opportunities. With every advancing technology, the law is always trying to catch up. And the law is trying to catch up with big data business. And I believe that will be one of the biggest trends over the course of the next year. So let me start with some big data absolutes. And the clicker's not working. Oh, there you go. So one absolute, and I start with these absolutes to set a framework for which the law has to apply, the law has to recognize. So data without identity is meaningless. You have to have some information associated with the data to render it meaning. Again, an unnamed file was not found. Of course not. Confusing, overlapping data can lead to misdirection. So to be effective, data has to apply analytics and processing to avoid this kind of confusion that may result from potentially overlapping different data from different sources. So if you're in room 307, which way do you go? Big data must be updated and kept accurate to be trusted. Otherwise, it's not trustworthy. Currently, it's 66 degrees, but the high today is only going to be 63. Bad data equals bad results. We all know that. Bad data in, bad data out. Here, a search for chicken parmesan found penny with sweet potatoes and fennel, minestrone with crisp parmesan crumbs, grilled polenta with morel vinaigrette. Well, no chicken parmesan. Data about children. And the law is also growing in that area. Child data, you must proceed with caution. The test is when people start giggling at some of these images, because they have all got a unique something wrong with them. So data laws today are very inconsistent. Within the United States, there's no real comprehensive data regulation scheme. Within Europe, there's a more comprehensive data regulation scheme, but it also varies from country to country, and it varies from the European Union to the United States. But data knows no boundaries, and that creates the inconsistency that's inherent in using data and manipulating data that comes from worldwide sources. So there's a tug and pull today between privacy advocates and business. And the law, usually represented in the federal and state legislature, and courts have struggled with the right balance in that tug and pull between privacy on the one hand and business opportunity on the other hand. Add to this the fact that reasonable expectations of privacy are changing today. There are now greater expectations of privacy with our own personally identifiable information, even though most of us acknowledge that our data is less private. We have less privacy than we have ever had before. Now, most of us are privacy pragmatists, I think. We want more control over our personal information, but we don't want to give up the advantages that data information processing can give us personally and our family and our businesses. So we're generally willing to engage in a trade-off. So how are privacy trade-offs made today? Well, the government, on the one hand, imposes constitutional and statutory constraints on government data actions like surveillance. And I don't know if you've been following the web today, but Second Circuit Court of Appeals, a Federal Circuit Court of Appeals today held that the NSA surveillance techniques that this guy Snowden exposed were contrary to the law and were not supported by the Patriot Act. So there you have even a tug and pull within government. Congress enacted the Patriot Act. The President and the NSA, acting under his authority, engaged in activities under the Patriot Act, and the court system comes in and says, no, they're not supported by the law. In the privacy sector, in the private business sector, privacy is generally managed by two things: notice and consent. So notice is typically contained in a privacy policy. That's the most common example. And consent is typically contained in accessing somebody's website or clicking I agree or clicking a box that you agree to the terms and conditions. So this pattern of informed consent defines an acceptable trade-off between privacy on the one hand and the benefits of information processing and data mining on the other. But big data itself is inherently consistent with privacy expectations. So let me give you an example. We have privacy laws such as HIPAA in the United States and the European Union data protection laws that rely upon anonymization. Information is made anonymous. And that facilitates the permissible flow of data from one entity to another. So in other words, data is rendered anonymous in order that it can be used or transferred. Big data degrades the effectiveness of anonymization. Big data is also inconsistent with consumers' awareness and expectations to how their data would be collected and used. There is a massive amount of unstructured, messy data out there. There is indefinite retention of data for unpredictable future uses. There is an unexpected aggregation of different data from different sources that may lead to unfair applications. So with big data, we consumers are much less aware of what personal information is being collected, who is collecting it, how is it being collected, how it's being combined with other data, and how it's being used and who's using it. In other words, the typical trade-off of notice and consent doesn't work well in the big data environment. So this creates a much more difficult and complex trade-off. On the one hand, big data offers enormous benefits, from detecting unknown or unexpected drug interactions, to reducing emergency room costs, to improving police response times, and many others that you've probably heard about today. But on the other hand, big data creates a loss of informational privacy. That is, we no longer have control or can determine for ourselves what personal information others can collect, what they can do with it, and how we will be affected by it. Let me give you a simple example. Trying to lose weight, download MyFitnessPal. I keep track of all my calories, the food I eat. Some of that food in the food database is restaurant-oriented. So I went to Qdoba, and I got the naked burrito. And I keep track of all of that information. Well, somebody is collecting all of that information. Somewhere, somehow, my eating habits are being collected. And I'm keeping on a 1,200 calorie per day regimen. Now, this weekend, I go to buy my kids donuts. And I buy 2 dozen donuts because they've all got friends staying over for the fight last Saturday night. So I go buy 2 dozen donuts. The credit card knows that I went to a donut shop and I paid for donuts. Now let's assume the insurance carrier that carries my health care insurance realizes that I'm keeping track of food on my FitnessPal and trying to lose weight because otherwise I'm at risk for all sorts of health care issues. But then they see my credit card bill buying donuts. What do they do with that information? In some actuarial database data mining system that is not manned by a human being, that kind of data being aggregated from multiple sources can lead to potentially an increase in my health care insurance premiums because they now consider myself a health care risk. So that is a simple example, and we all know, we all think, we all hope it's not occurring to us, but we all have that sense that maybe it is. So this is one of my favorite lawyer images because we always answer questions, it depends. So you've got a sign that says stop, but then somebody else, the other sign is saying no stopping anytime. What do you do? Which way do we go? Do we go to the route of privacy or do we go the route of business? So let me move now to kind of from the legal perspective, because what I'm going to suggest is you have to take into account law and business and government and privacy advocates and consumers. You have to take into account the fact that data is being collected. You have to take into account the fact that private data is being collected. And you have to take into account the benefits of that. So the law, as it's going to be created by government, enforced by the courts or regulatory agencies, has to take those things into account. But we, in the business area of data mining and using big data and applying technologies to collect, aggregate, and use big data, we also have to be mindful of the privacy expectations of consumers, the billions of consumers whose data is being collected. So what do we know today in the law environment? Most regulations are sector-specific. In other words, they apply to certain industries. HIPAA applies to healthcare. Gramm-Leach-Bliley applies to finance. They are specific to a certain industry. There's no comprehensive data law in the United States. The other important thing is the Federal Trade Commission and its enforcement capabilities. Third, we have multiple privacy laws uprooting and being birthed from state to state to state. About 47 states now have some sort of privacy law or data breach law that if personally identifiable information, private information is disclosed, there are certain requirements, there are certain penalties, there are certain sanctions that come into play. And then finally, one of the more important lawyer enforcing mechanisms is consumer class actions, none of which we want to see. So again, sector specific. In the United States, no single law. There's no overriding federal law, and they're primarily grouped by industry. And I'll give you an example of Indiana Code Section 24-4.9 is the law governing Indiana's data breach requirements. So a security breach is defined as an unauthorized acquisition of computerized data, which compromises personally identifiable information. Personal information can include either your Social Security number or your name and address, or one of the following: a driver's license number, a state ID number, a credit card number, a debit card, or some sort of financial account number. If there's a data breach, a business must notify all affected consumers of that, and the disclosure must be made without reasonable delay. It must be provided to the affected persons by either mail, telephone, fax, or email, and to all the consumer reporting agencies if your data breach affects more than 1,000 Indiana residences. Now, to the extent that you collect here in Indiana data from Ohio, California, or any other state, then you may be subject to their state data breach notification regulations. So it's not just a data breach that may occur in Indiana. You need to look at the scope of what the effect is. The Attorney General may seek injunctive relief or penalties up to $150,000 per deceptive act. The other thing is, the other very active mechanism in the law right now is the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC is broadly interpreting its authority to prohibit unfair and deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. The FTC broadly interprets that to apply to data breaches, to privacy, to the use of data, to the dissemination, to disclosure of data. In January of this year, the FTC published a very important paper, white paper, guidance, whatever you want to call it, called the Internet of Things. And in the Internet of Things, the FTC makes several recommendations. Number one, build security into devices at the outset. Train employees about the importance of security. Ensure security is managed at the appropriate level in the organization. In other words, this is no longer just an IT issue. Data security applies to your entire corporate environment, from the CEO all the way down. It is no longer just an IT or technical issue. In fact, the FBI estimates that more than 90% of all data breaches could have been prevented, not by technical means, but by education means. In other words, humans doing stupid things. Opening up emails that are clearly phishing emails. Clicking on attachments that install malware onto a computer device. Leaving a laptop or an iPhone in a coffee shop or at the airport, accessing the internet in an open and exposed environment like the Indiana Convention Center. Ensure that when outside providers are hired, those providers are capable of maintaining reasonable security and provide reasonable oversight of the providers. We all know that many of the data breaches, the massive data breaches that are occurring today, are not caused by the entity that got breached, Anthem, Target, others, but caused by some sort of third-party connection. And so you need to understand as a business what we call kind of a data risk allocation. The risk of a data breach, how is that going to be allocated between your company and your vendors? And that comes into contractual arrangements. Who's going to indemnify who? Who's going to be responsible for the breach? Who's going to maintain insurance coverage for a data breach? Do any of you have insurance coverage for a data breach? When a security risk is identified, consider a defensive depth strategy whereby multiple layers of security may be used to defend against a particular risk. These are FTC recommendations, and while they are guidelines and recommendations, what usually happens at the FTC level is at some point these things become reasonable expectations, industry standards, and can provide the basis for negligent claims and consumer class actions if you don't follow them. So while these are not legal requirements today, they are very, very good guidelines to begin implementing in your company. Consider measures to keep unauthorized users from accessing a consumer's device, data, or personal information stored on a network. One of the most prevalent data breach occurrences now are mobile devices, laptops, phones, iPads. Monitor connected devices throughout their expected life cycle. Provide security patches to cover known risks. Notify consumers and give them choices about how their information will be used. Again, the FTC is still much behind the notice aspect of notice and consent, how you do the trade-off in privacy issues. The FTC also recommends what it calls data minimization. So what is data minimization? Limiting the collection of consumer data to the extent possible, retain that information only for a set period of time and not indefinitely, and then apply a flexible approach. Companies can choose to collect no data. They can choose to collect data limited to categories required to provide the services that they're engaged in, less sensitive by using less sensitive data, or they can de-identify the data collected. So why does the FTC believe in data minimization? Well, the FTC is trying to apply that privacy trade-off. So the FTC believes that data minimization addresses two privacy risks. One, that a company with a large store of consumer data will be a more enticing target for data thieves or hackers. True statement. And that consumer data will be used in ways contrary to consumers' expectations. Again, a true statement. The FTC also recommends in another paper that they released on careful connections, building security in the Internet of Things. This is really designed and provides recommendations for those who are in the data security business, in the device creation business, in the data mining business. But very good things. Just go through these quickly. Fundamentals, take advantage of what experts have learned about security. Design your product with authentication in mind. Protect the interfaces between your product and other devices and services. And here I would add, protect your company interfaces with other companies, other vendors. And that goes back to all of your vendors are potential leaks or routes for a data breach. Consider how to limit permissions. Take advantage of readily available security tools. Test the security measures before launching your product. Nobody has accused the FTC of not being Mr. Obvious on some occasions, but you will be amazed as a lawyer who comes in after a data breach has occurred and starts asking these questions of a company, a very sophisticated company with a large IT budget, a very sophisticated IT budget with sophisticated employees. I will come in and ask these questions, and half of them are answered in the negative. The companies just aren't doing what is common sense. They aren't doing the Mr. Obvious things. And that goes to what the FBI said, 90% or more could have been prevented just by applying common sense security measures. Education, it's not just IT, it's education, it's supervision, it's re-education, it's enforcement, it's compliance. Select a secure choice as your default settings. Many default settings are not secure. Use your initial communications with customers to educate them about the safest use of a product. Establish an effective approach for updating your security procedures. That's critical. Don't just put them in place and forget about them. Keep your ear to the ground. Follow the blogs. Find out what hackers are doing. Find out, keep your ear to the ground internally. Find out how your employees are using mobile devices, where they're using it. Are they following the procedures that you put into place? The FTC does have both enforcement and guidance requirements. The enforcement actions can be brought under the FTC Act. They can be brought under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the Children's Online Privacy Act. The FTC has a ton of consumer education and business guidance materials available, and they're constantly supporting and sponsoring presentations along these lines. They encourage and they participate in multi-stakeholder efforts, and there's a lot of advocacy to other agencies at the federal, state, and local level. As I made the note before, what I said is FTC guidelines and recommendations frequently become the law, or at least a guideline for which reasonable versus non-reasonable, negligent versus non-negligent standards can be applied. The White House issued a Consumer Bill of Rights, so the White House is also on top of the privacy issue. Now, White House is also very much a supporter of big data efforts. And they've done a lot of things to support the use of big data in the federal government and in businesses. The Consumer Bill of Rights, and again, you can see some of the points. Notice. Notice requires transparency. So think about notice and consent again. Transparency. Respect for context. Consumers have the right to understand how their data is going to be used. Security. Consumers have a right to secure and responsible handling of personal data. Access and accuracy. Consumers have a right to access and correct personal data in usable formats. And finally, focused collection. Consumers have a right to reasonable limits on the personal data that companies collect, as well as reasonable time limits. And accountability. Consumers have the right to personal data handled by companies with appropriate measures in place to assure they adhere to this Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. So again, use this along with the FTC guidelines as your own framework to creating effective privacy trade-offs within your own company, within your own data mining business, with your own data breach security business, etc. So the question again is, can I or can't I? Yes, no, it depends. This is why you sometimes need a lawyer. Can you turn right here? So, if all this lawyer talk seems over the top and way too much, especially at the end of the day, I'm just another lawyer getting in the way of progress, right? So remember, you can disregard me, you can disregard what I've said, but another lawyer will just replace me. Thank you very much.